So welcome to today's episode of Interactive Brokers Podcasts, and I'm going to start off with something a little different. In the immortal words of James T. Kirk, captain of the Starship Enterprise, space is, he said, the final frontier. His mission was to explore strange new worlds, to seek out new life and new civilizations, and to boldly go where no man has gone before. Maybe it's not so much about new life and new civilizations as much as it has to do with other things. To find out more, I'm speaking today to Alexander Gunz, who is fund manager at Heptagon Capital in London. Alex, welcome back to the show.
Always a pleasure to be here, Andrew. Thank you.
You're very welcome. It's always great to have you as a guest. You wrote a really good article recently, and we put the notes to it in the show notes here. Let me start that again. Alex, it's always a pleasure to have you back on the show. You wrote a fantastic piece recently called Space, the Race is On, and we've put a link to that article from your site onto the show notes here in this podcast. You said recently in that piece that space has become such a hot topic specifically as the next frontier for both defense and data. Can you add some context to that for the audience, please?
Yeah, that would be an absolute pleasure. Space is a theme we've been writing about, thinking about, looking for opportunities to invest in for some time. But I think what's really changed, Andrew, is that you've almost seen a confluence or a coming together, if you will, of several factors. That's an improvement in hardware, an improvement in software, an improvement in materials. And as a result, the cost of launching things into space has fallen significantly. Therefore, the number of objects that are going up into space is increasing proportionately. What we're also seeing is that clearly in this currently much more stressed and tensed world that I'm sure all the listeners are fully aware of, is that geopolitics is very much front of mind, and almost winning in space, if you will, be as important in the future, in our view, as having success on land, on sea, in the air. But I think really the crucial point, and this is something we laid out in quite some detail in the piece we wrote, is that importantly, pretty much anything that goes up into space will be inherently dual use. In other words, if space is about data, that data can be used both for military reasons and for much more benign reasons too.
What's the current estimated size of the global space industry, and what's the growth trajectory look like?
It's already a pretty massive industry, Andrew, on most accounts, and obviously it depends exactly how you classify these things. The industry today is about $600 billion in size. And when you really look out, let's say, to 2040, that seems like a fairly reasonable time horizon. The sense is that the industry probably could double in size. And this is a forecast not just that we've plucked out of thin air. If you were to look at consultants, if you were to look even at estimates provided by US defense agencies and by investment banks, they all seem to come up with figures somewhere between $1 and $2 trillion out in the medium term. And I think really to add to the point I made in your initial question, the number of use cases for space is much less about tourism or about the sci-fi that I guess many of us grew up with, but it's much more about data. And as we talked about in the piece, connecting the unconnected.
Can you talk about you referred to it earlier on, the changing costs of putting something into space, please, Alex?
Yeah, it's really quite remarkable. And this is why space has become so exciting. If you go back to the Apollo era, it cost about $55,000 to send every kilo up into space of payload. That figure, and this is the same path we've seen, say, with semiconductors, we've seen with solar panels, there's been roughly a 99% change in that period of time. So in other words, today on the heavy Falcons, it's about $1,000 per kilo of payload. So that's an absolutely massive rate of change. Another much more simple way of putting it is that within the last 10 years, costs have come down by a factor of about 20. And if you're asking the reason why, I'd really call out three factors. Number one would be simply reusability. This is something that clearly Elon Musk and SpaceX have got down to a fine art. That cuts the cost massively by about 70% for some parts. Number two is simply manufacturing efficiencies. You're getting better the whole time with better material science. And number three is simply just the scale that the industry has, that the more launches, again, the better you get.
Now, the piece you wrote, Alex, referred to several key drivers, putting us on what you called the cusp of a new golden age in space, enabled by AI-driven software, hardware materials science, and private sector entrepreneurs. Are we set to see an increasing number of investing opportunities, do you think?
I think that's very likely, Andrew. To give you context, certainly when I was growing up, when many listeners perhaps were too, it was all about the sort of classic Star Wars, if you will, and the battle between the United States and Russia. To frame it in a much more global context now, there are about 90 countries, 90 countries, that have ambitions either to put things in space or have put things in space. And beyond the really obvious countries, so clearly joining the US and Russia, you've got China with a very ambitious space program. You've got India too. You've got other much less obvious, if you will, nations like Peru, Thailand, Saudi Arabia getting in on the act too. And I think what's changed is not just the falling costs that we discussed previously, but the fact that simply private sector investment is growing. In other words, governments are or have gone down the path of saying, look, why don't we outsource this or do joint ventures with the private sector? And this can be a much quicker and more efficient way of getting things into space. So to bring that into numbers, we have seen in the last decade about $50 billion US dollars of VC money going into space-backed startups. The other data point I'd call out is that last year, the number of VC-backed space deals reached a record number of about 700. So I guess, that's the exciting backdrop. The challenge for investors, as ever, and often in the discussions we have, Andrew, is how you practically set about accessing that. In other words, the number of listed businesses, and bear in mind our focus is on listed equity plays, the number of pure play listed space businesses is actually very small today. Going forward, that will almost certainly change. Clearly, we have this dynamic where many businesses are choosing to stay private for longer, but given this sort of amount of capital that's building up, given the interest in the investment community, I really wouldn't be surprised if we saw more space plays come to market in the coming years.
What does space exploration solve for mankind, do you think?
I think it solves many things, Andrew, but almost to take a step back, and this again was a point we made in the piece we wrote, is that a lot of things that you, I, everyone listening will take for granted are actually a function of what occurs in space behind the scenes, if you will. In other words, GPS on your phone knowing exactly where you're located, long-term weather forecasting, if you're making a call to the other side of the world, maybe even if we're recording a session like this, a lot of that data communication is really reliant upon space. One of the statistics that I found really shocking when I was researching the piece we wrote was that last year about 200 subsea cables were cut around the world. That's the United Nations figure. And so obviously if you're worried about data security and it's not safe per se to carry data under the water any longer, maybe actually beaming it up and down via satellites can be a solution or part of the solution. But to answer the question directly, what does space solve for humankind? This is the way I'd put it. I used the expression earlier on in our conversation that space is about creating a digital infrastructure in the sky. It's about connecting the unconnected. And the statistic from the International Telecoms Union is that globally, about 2.6 billion people lack access to the internet. That's pretty remarkable. You think about it, global population, 8 and a bit, 2.6 lack access to the internet. So the theory is that once more low Earth orbit satellites are actually put up there, in other words, the SpaceX, the Blue Origin constellations that are being put into space, this will allow people in much less developed, much poorer parts of the world to get access to the internet. And the benefits that can bring in terms of education, in terms of prosperity, should be very evident.
What about the threats, though, Alex, to the geographical balance of power from the race into space?
Well, I think the clue is in the name, in the sense that this is a race. There is a degree of posturing in terms of suggesting, just like we saw in previous eras of space development, that country A's state of development is ahead of country B's, for example. But But I guess the reality is that, look, given the falling costs, the number of objects being launched into space, as we said, is going up. The cadence roughly prior to the start of this decade was about 200 objects a year into space. Now it's gone up to about 3,000 a year. If you project forward to that 2040 time horizon we talked about, it's maybe 10,000 a year. So I guess the conclusion that it seems very reasonable to us to draw is that space will become increasingly congested, contested, and competitive. And the reality is that miscalculations as a result can occur. There's also the dynamic worth bearing in mind that in 1967, there was a document signed between the US and Russia called the Outer Space Treaty. And this basically said that no nation, and bear in mind, even at the height of the Cold War, this was, no nation has sovereignty per se over outer space. And that's all well and good, but I think we've seen politicians of all colors from all nations not necessarily adhering to international treaties. There'd also be other nations like China, for example, that never signed up to that treaty in the first place. So that could be a source of conflict too. And I guess ultimately, the reality is that, look, there's only a finite amount of space, if you will, in space at any given level of altitude. There's only a certain number of radio bandwidths and locations where you can specifically put satellites. So this is really where tensions, miscalculations could occur. And I think all of this is occurring against a backdrop where we're seeing defense spending around the world going up. Space today is about 10% of most developed countries' defense budgets. That compares to only a couple of percentage points at the start of the century. And I think that really gives an indication of how important space has become.
I was shocked in your piece by the increasing amount of space junk that has to be out there, because everything really only has a certain shelf life, does it not?
Yes, so that's absolutely right. Again, that's another problem, and again, where these accidents or miscalculations perhaps can occur. And clearly it's a function of where you locate your satellite, and the average asset life will vary in that sense. So if you have a low Earth orbit satellite, these satellites, because they're smaller, they're closer to the Earth, they don't need to be quite so robust. These will have an average asset life of maybe 5 to 7 years. If you go up to mid-Earth orbit, you maybe go up to about 10 years asset life, 10 to 15, and then geostationary, higher up, you're up at maybe 20 years of asset life. But again, given the sheer rate at which objects are being launched into space, and bear in mind, we're just talking about satellites here. There'll also be other things like the International Space Station, and we haven't even talked about more sort of peripheral elements like, say, trying to launch missions to Mars and so on. But I think that the reality is that we all perhaps have this somewhat idealized vision of space being a relatively blank canvas. But as we talked about in our piece, it is, and again, to repeat that expression, it is becoming congested, contested, and competitive.
Thank you very much indeed, Alexander Gunz of Heptagon Capital, for joining me today.
Always a pleasure being on the show, Andrew, and very happy to talk with you again.
All right, brilliant. And to the audience, if you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe wherever you download your podcast from. Bye for now.
The analysis in this material is provided for information only and is not and should not be construed as an offer to sell or the solicitation of an offer to buy any security. To the extent that this material discusses general market activity, industry, or sector trends, or other broad-based economic or political conditions, it should not be construed as research or investment advice. To the extent that it includes references to specific securities, commodities, currencies, or other instruments, those references do not constitute a recommendation by IBKR to buy, sell, or hold such investments. This material does not and is not intended to take into account the particular financial conditions, investment objectives, or requirements of individual customers. Before acting on this material, you should consider whether it is suitable for your particular circumstances and, as necessary, seek professional advice.